So would love to welcome everyone here today. Feel free to take a chair if it's more comfortable for you to sit down for the little piece at the beginning. We'd like to begin by acknowledging the territories on which we are living and working, the amazing gift it is for us as uninvited guests to this territory to be living and learning in the land of the Wasanich, the Lekwungen-speaking, the Esquimalt, Songhees, Salish peoples. It is an amazing thing to have the opportunity to learn how to be legal visitors in an uninvited territory in a different way at this time and place. And we're really happy to have you here for our gallery walk today. And so we thought we would start. This is Professor Gillian Calder. I am Professor Rebecca Johnson, and Professor Sara Ramshaw over here in the other corner have been working with Lorinda Fraser, one of our own who had gone off to do her master's in museum work, and she worked with us to curate a sampling of projects that have been handed in by students in our law school over a number of years.
Yeah, so part of what we've been thinking and talking about is how evaluation and iterative learning is part of what we do at law school. Like, how do we bring deep learning to our students through the kinds of assignments that we give students the opportunity to do, and how much of who our students are forms what they go on to do, and how much of law involves creativity, imagination, and empathy, and how do we train those skills. So in all of those different ways, what some of us have done, and many other people in this building, is create opportunities for students when they are doing assignments in their exams or within their courses to have opportunities to answer questions in ways that the question demands. And so sometimes, and for most of law, those are textual answers. Do you have somewhere you need to be?
No, I'm pretending that wasn't me, so
okay.
Let's just...
Please don't go.
No, it's probably telling me to be here.
In most assignments and on most opportunities in law, those are textual responses. Those are written answers, essays, exams. But in other ways, sometimes the question needs to be answered drawing on some other form of argumentation. And what you have in the room is a sampling of some of those. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk around a little bit and talk about some of these projects, and I'm going to try to keep Rebecca from talking too long about.
Good luck.
Yeah. And what we won't be able to give you is the exact question each student was asked, but what you'll know is that there are projects in this room from constitutional law, criminal law, business associations, family law, sexual orientation in the law, directed reading projects, and others. And the questions the students were asked to answer were their classmates were given the same questions. Some of those wrote papers. Some of them were worth 10% of their mark. Some of it was pass-fail. Some of it was the entirety of their mark in the course. So that's why some of them are very different in scope, in size, in engagement. So we're just going to walk and talk. We totally invite you to ask questions, to interrupt, to interrogate, to be concerned that we're doing this, right? To find out, why and how and what our experiences have been, how we hold a paper and a project side by side. What have we done to make sure that we're able to mark those with integrity?
And also, what have we learned in the process with engaging with students who've provided for us work that is different than kind of conventional expectations for this kind of work. And like with all gallery tours, we'll cluster in front of something and there'll be chairs, so people who are ready to sit, grab a chair, people who can get down from the floor and then somehow get back up, that's not me anymore, can feel free to sit on those spaces as we move around. So
Where would you want to start?
Let's start with you and Sara.
Me and Sara?
Or wherever.
Well, Sara,
Sara.
Sara, come too. So, yeah.
Is there poetry?
Yep, there is. On the bench up there are some stories that have been handed in, poetry books. There's a poem that's been published in the Law Journal that was handed in as an exam in federalism in first year constitutional law in December, was then published. So there's a few examples like that around. So there's also, some of these are purely visual, some of them are videos. You can put headphones on and listen to songs that students have written, and some of them are textual.
So why don't we start with games then,
Okay.
as a genre, since many of you are around here. So this first area has on it a table with 4 different game categories. Let's talk about yours.
So I'll just talk very briefly about the game on the far end, which was a game handed in as family law, worth 40% of the mark. And the question that was asked is, how does law regulate your understanding of the family? So the students could answer in any way. This student wanted to write about obstacles that exist to gay men adopting in Canada. There is no formal barriers in any way in law to gay men adopting, but there are all sorts of other kinds of obstacles. So you play the game, and the goal with your partner is to get to the end where you adopt a baby. But you have to cross identity barriers and financial barriers and other kind of barriers to get there. And it is one of the best projects I've ever received in when you play the game, you feel it in your body. You understand the obstacles that you would not have got the same sense of from reading it. It's fun to engage with, but you never lose sight of that this is a real struggle. And it makes the argument that homophobia exists in many of our practices around how we create families in Canada, even with the shifts in formal law. It was a stunning project, and often when I'm encouraging students to think about doing projects, I bring out this game for them to play. It gives them a sense of what possibilities might be for them.
So in terms of game tables, you can see there's also different kinds of games on the table and different forms of engagements. So part of the work with games and students is beginning to think about how creating the rules of a game and learning how to change the rules as you go along can provide space for thinking about different kinds of questions about not only how you engage with the concept, but how you think about teaching people you work with, teaching within families, how to see structural and systemic patterns, and also to think about the difference between collaborative games, competitive games, mystery games. Like the genre of gaming can help work through a lot of different kinds of challenges and different forms of games. So sometimes students work with the structures they already know. So taking something like Settlers of Catan, for those of you who've played that kind of a game, and then to modify the Settlers game to think about the place of economy and settlement. So we have games that draw on that form. Games that are card games that then similarly draw off kind of a zombie game. So part of what works in this is also thinking about the relationship, how to think differently about plagiarism and creativity, like what it means to draw up the resources of things that you have and then modify and adapt to move them forward. On the images up here, you'll see other images of projects not here being placed. And so on the game table, I would also just echo some of what Gillian said about the looking at a game and the playing of a game. So one of the challenges in marking a game, for example, or engaging with a game, is how much of a game becomes pleasurable when you know its rules and start to be able to play creatively within the structure of the game. So sometimes from a marking perspective, it becomes interesting, like it's quicker to mark a paper, but a game teaches you other kinds of things. So one game will go by in the background at some point that's a very simple game with very basic kind of tools, but it had to be played in the playing. So there's a photo of me, and I brought a friend over and our young boys, and then we tried to play this game that involved changing the rules all the time. And watching the boys take up the new rules of creating rules like if you didn't say, "All hail the king," at the beginning, you lost points. So the realizing the randomness that came through the playing was such a part of the pleasure of the game. But so you can see various forms, including with this one, a modified Monopoly board with the paper on the bottom talking about the other alternative history of Monopoly or anti-Monopoly. So you again see people taking up games and actively shoving them or pushing them to make them not exactly a game you would play, but a game that you would think through. So games and gaming is a kind of category of things that students have thought with and played with and learned with, and that we have learned from in those engagements.
Yeah, and business associations and family law, so different courses where those were taken up. We'll move you to this next table, and sort of some of the vast majority of things that have been handed into us really have fallen into sort of the object category. So I'm going to talk first about this sculpture over here. So this sculpture was created by a student in a family. This is again a 40% family law project, and the same question: how does law regulate our understanding of the family? But our student, a trans man, who is the birth mother of his 2 children. So he gave birth to his children and then later transitioned and lives as a transgender man. And he was our first year student. And in his first year here, and this is a story he tells publicly, his parents sued him for custody of his children because he was living as a transgender man. He did this project, and it captures what it is to be the birth mother, a man who gave birth. And so that's the image. It's a pregnant body, and those of you who are standing where you are looking up the stirrups. So it was positioned, so that's what people saw when they came in the door. But it also has a book alongside it where he's taken the book of Are You My Mother? Sorry, Susan. Oh, sorry, I thought you were laughing at that. No. The book of Are You My Mother? And he's changed the book to play with the notion of gender as a binary and the questions of what it means to be someone's mother. And what was amazing is after he did this project, and I bring this project down all the time, is we had a moment at the law school where there was some confusion about our ability to change our bathrooms to be gender inclusive, and students felt uncomfortable. And our student then told a story about what it means to live, to do things like go into a changing room in the building where a swimming pool is when you are a man and your children are calling you mom. So he shared that story. It flowed out of doing this kind of work, and it really was transformative in this place of conversation, of generosity, of how we engage in some really difficult things. So that was pretty amazing. And I'll just do very quickly, this box here, this museum box, was a 100% project in sexual orientation in the law. Of course, the students call Sex O. And it comes along with a guide to the museum box of items, and then a tape recorder story, although it's written, of this student coming back to the law school in 2057 to discover the challenges of issues of gender and trans identity being now museum items, that we lived in a different world. So it's got this hope and idea, this idea of transformation, and it's captured in a very accessible form. So again, both projects pushing the boundaries on different kinds of questions, both projects drawn from personal experience of the students, and both that I feel very shaped by having been part of.
The next box has 2 different business associations, BIZAZ for short, in it. And both of these projects, so the one you can see is a matryoshka that the person has taken and then covered over and transformed into being layers of corporate capitalism within layers of corporate capitalism, with unpicking it and moving down from the outside being the textual layer of parts of the legislative framework. And this is an engagement with J.K. Gibbs and Graham's book, Take Back the Economy. So for business associations, every project is engaging with that book. How can we creatively imagine business and its challenges otherwise? So then it moves through layers of work, what forms of work people do, moves through layers of connections between national and international food products, moves into monetary systems, networks, and then there is a little bit of copulation, I think, reproduction at a different level going on down here, and moving down to the center and the final black box, which when one opens it and pulls out the secret scroll to discover what the answer is, of course, it's the giant question mark at the center. One of the things that's interesting about this particular project is this student was very concerned or worried about the requirement for words at all times. So his argument was we should be able to stand without words, and so he handed in this project with no textual support. Usually in my classes for these projects, the argument is it's not about the product, it's about the process. So you can have a project that completely fails to do what the student imagined it would do, that comes in conjunction with a textual support or a paper that talks about what they learned in the process of attempting something that didn't work. So the goal is really on having the process questions be central to the work, not simply the object as the in the context of this course. But this student was like, no, I'm giving you nothing, it's just this. So it was very interesting starting to have the experience of thinking, what is it to mark or to evaluate or simply to engage with a project where no words are offered to you? So this project I've learned so much from because it required me to think about what assumptions I was bringing to the interpretation of each of these layers. And it really opens itself up for thinking about the job of lawyering as often precisely this, that we don't often have the guide that tells us how we are to interact with the various layers we pull apart. So kind of the project opens itself up, pun intended and unintended, to these many levels. This other piece right here came with textual support, two beautiful beaded feathers where the student talked about learning beginning the process of learning how to bead a feather and what she was learning in the doing. And then she beaded two feathers, one of which she tried to do on this day of International Women's Day, thinking about women's work internationally and about the massive amounts of work that are required of women in particular. And so she did the work on this only after she had always completed a 12-hour day of work before she started the work on beading. And then monitored the amount of time, the experience, the felt experience of doing the work, as opposed to the other one that she did on a day where she cleared everything off, worked at her own pace, with her own imaginative tools to produce the feather, and then reflected on the actual costs of materials and the question of value, so how we place the value in these pieces. So the objects are beautiful here, as well as the question of the feathers. What kinds of feathers could she use or could she not use? What's layered in a feather? What does she learn from working with the importance of the feather as a sign of law itself? So in some of these, when you look at them, there are pieces of text that accompany them, but often not just explaining the work, but thinking about the processes of what the person learns from the work of engaging in the work. Okay? So that's these.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I mean, we could take the whole time talking on just this one table, but you know, there is a question about whether the piece you create makes the argument in and of itself. Not all of them have to be accompanied by something that explains it, and that's part of, if it doesn't stand alone, then maybe you should have chosen a different medium in order to make your arguments, right? It isn't just about doing art, it's about enhancing the argument, seeing the connection between the medium and the message. This mask, for example, was accompanied with a set of teachings that this student, who is Métis, had given orally for her niece. So it was really important. The mask captures part of how she feels in family law identity as a Métis person, but the tape recorder then was the teachings, and that was given to her niece. So I don't have that piece of the project. So some of these are partial hints into some of this incredible work.
The dress, if you've taken a look at it, this is kind of an example of something that might make its argument through its performance. So you can absolutely go and take a look underneath, and you'll see that there's a
whole new meaning to upskirting.
A whole new meaning to upskirting. So it does say, turn the dress inside out to see what are the hidden costs of fast fashion. So there's a discount label on the dress. It came in a lovely bag with wrapping paper around it, performing the whole pleasures of unwrapping a beautiful new dress. It included its sort of internal tag that asked us, how much is this discount dress worth? And then on the back, it tells you in small print, the actual dress is handmade. It's not $3 at H&M with 12 hours of labor, $65 of material, but invites you to turn it inside out. And then on the inside are a whole series of tags, each of which will speak to the hidden costs, including the production of super weeds, costs of suicide, poorly made clothing, increased anxiety and depression, temporary labor. It goes on with all of the hidden costs. And then the book has in it, on the inside, all of the text of the tags, as well as the footnotes to where the person found those citations. So you also see kind of the argument being explained and performed in a fashion that nicely matches the work of the work, though, and certainly everything that's in here people know, but there's something about the pulling a dress up out of a bag and turning it inside out that punches the argument in a kind of way that makes it hard to unsee once a person has seen it. There is also a separate project up here called the Golden Cage, a beautiful piece of jewelry with the flowers of the community commons garden trying to emerge out, but being constrained by the outer shell of the structure that impedes movement as the student was grappling with the challenge, can we make change through individual action, or are those actions inadequate to help us disentangle the structures that hold us in the same place? So again, performing that kind of tension of the argument in the piece of jewelry itself.
One other category that we have, curation of
Feel free to come in close or move your chairs if you wish.
yeah.
Yeah.
Is visual art. And you can see this set of paintings here, for example, is a project handed in family law, one in constitutional law, and one in business association. So all three of them asking different questions. And those two paintings above each other were one project in sexual orientation, and that's also a BizAz project, right? So again, the stories behind each one of these, I could talk for tons and tons of time. I'll just say this painting here was a 10% assignment in constitutional law, where the students were asked to go to a community event, any event in their community, a talk at the law school or something at home, and then write about how they saw the Constitution in that event. So how could they draw a connection between something they were attending and Canadian constitutional law? And this student did this painting about a disconnect in her life as an Iranian person living in Canada, participating in a traditional ceremony. But more importantly, it comes with some writing, and then it also came with some food, as how important the opportunity had been for her to engage, and to engage visually in her journey through law school, that at that moment in time it was really important to be able to express herself. And again, with the visual, in my courses, I very much demand the students to engage with literature on the image in law, or popular culture in law, in order to be able to justify why they're using this particular form to make the argument. And I would just say very briefly, I am not an artist, right? I could not paint myself out of a bag. So again, the ability to then evaluate the work of other people, to evaluate it against something that I can very easily mark, a thesis, 40-page paper with footnotes, right? So that has been also a learning journey about how to be able to offer critical feedback. And in the process of doing this project pedagogy thing that we've been able to do this week, I've gone back to some of the comments that I gave the students when I handed back their work. And it's so interesting to see the transformation of me, my ability to offer them critical feedback, because not every project in this room got a great mark out of 100, right? Because not all of them achieved the goals, but at the same time, the learning is deep and thick. So.
Sarah, did you want to speak to, or is Sarah still here? Do you want to speak to this lovely?
Because it matches quite well with the painting, because it's also an Iranian student living in Canada, and we take for granted the idea of adoption. Often judges say it's the only pleasurable thing they have is when they are able to provide or certify or finalize an adoption. In her culture, even though it's a stigma to not be able to have children, it's also a stigma to adopt. And so she was trying to portray this. She actually had her sister and brother-in-law visiting, and their child, who'd been adopted, visiting, and so she had them act out and create a photo essay on this particular issue. And then again, in providing the evidence or the research, she discussed it at length and provided footnotes and research possibilities and bibliography in that. Yes. So.
On the visuals, I'll point over to this corner for a moment for another visual. This one is interesting partly because over the course of the week you'll see it's like this with this piece of paper, and it arrived actually in a total covered piece of paper with scissors and a dare to take up the question of how we remove blinders. So in the unwrapping of the thing, I was also struck with the question, so do I treat it as do I cut it or do I not? Because it's a piece of the paper is kind of a piece of the work itself, but the question was, do I have the ability to break down the blinders and the courage and the ingenuity to diverge and to reveal? So I did start by doing the question, well, what would I cut out? How would I do the cut? And finally, I couldn't stand it anymore as I was revealing it, and I just took the one side of the paper off so I could see this kind of really beautiful, haunting work that's behind it that leaves like, at what point do I make visible? Do I cover back up? What's the relationships between that? But when we placed it up, I placed it like this, and almost every day I come in and then someone's worried that it's down and has placed it back up. So feel free to, at any point, but these questions, again, about what's the relationship that's ongoing between the art, when do we think it's done, what it is, how does it invite us to interact with it? Okay, so there's just on the visuals. I really worried about that. Cheating. Oh, I didn't worry about if I was cheating. I tried to celebrate or settle myself into that pleasure. Yeah, the pleasurable question. Sara's over in that corner, so maybe we'll just point to the witness box for just a moment, because in the witness box, Sara, do you want to talk to the musicality?
Yes, except, only one's mine. Yes, so they also, students also had the possibility of composing a piece of music or composing lyrics in relation to a particular issue. There's some bizazz ones here. I have two family law ones here. So one was about the music of change, the shifting face of marriage, and it's a piano composition, two sort of compositions, and the student explains what the movements meant to him, and because I certainly, even though I work with improvising musicians, I wouldn't have been able to know exactly, so I definitely needed this explanation as to what was the choice of notes and how it related to this particular project. Actually, I think it was three movements. And again, this provides the textual and the research basis. You've got a bibliography, and in that. And then another one for family law was it was called Redesign, and again explaining sort of the way that sort of changing. They were both about sort of the way the changing face of marriage in many ways, and this particular student. Wrote the lyrics and wrote a guitar. It was played on the guitar. Unfortunately, the student wanted to remain anonymous because they weren't very happy with their singing voice. So we've taken any sort of attribution of this, but I think it's excellent. But in a sense, the lyrics speak to themselves. And then I think, do you want to talk about the bizazz ones?
Well, just for people to, as we're thinking again about what projects mean, on the music pieces, another thing that happened frequently here is people work together in collaboration. So part of the work of producing the music was itself collaborative, as a group of 4 students got together to create a song that would show what would this look like if you imagined a sole proprietor, what would this look like if you imagined working in partnership or in a co-op or in a corporation. So they're trying to musically map out 4 versions of a song that meet what they've been thinking about in terms of the structure. But again, the work they reflected in their small reflection pieces afterwards about what it meant to have a space where they worked as people who had prior musical backgrounds together to kind of try and produce something as a group. So the work of the music, you can listen to it and occupy the witness box and think about what it means to witness through music, to listen to these tapes, but also, again, to think about music itself as something that we write down and inscribe, but it exists in performance and it exists through collaborative movement. So there's, again, so much learning for both the students and us in thinking about what does it mean to think about music not only through the lens of like intellectual property, but also through the lens of performance and law.
So if I can just say very briefly too, our curator, Lorinda Fraser, made some conscious choices about how to transform this room so that what happens if we think differently about how we engage with law here within what looks very much like a courtroom. So to have the person in the witness box have the headphones on and be listening was an interesting transformation of what we think of when we put people in those spots. I have had also music handed into me in classes, and again, when people want to explain the lyrics or explain the movements, one thing that I've appreciated is to try to do it within the genre of what you're doing. So for example, students handing in liner notes with a CD cover with images, right? So fitting the way that they're making the argument, again, medium and message. And I would also say that one of the challenges in doing this work has been expectations of people or judgment in some ways, that either this giving people a chance to do a project is a really easy A, someone hand in a cake to Calder and you'll get an A, versus like how to really gauge the amount of work that goes into some of these projects against a paper, where we can tell if a student hasn't done the depth of research that they need to do to make the argument or considered counter argument. So how are we measuring those things? And also doing a project, and some of these projects are like extraordinarily elaborate, right? All the pieces to it. Like, is that fair as well, right? Because otherwise, I say to a student, if you go more than 10 pages, you're going to lose, 5 marks for every word over it comes off, right? So how are we seeing the connections and enabling to do this kind of work? So pragmatically.
Yeah, about the difference between worrying primarily about the evaluation component and worrying about the deep learning component. And they might not always match up. That's a thing people have talked about in academia for many years, where to put our energies. Right? Yeah. Maybe let's talk about the bench, since we're so close to it. So at the bench up at the front, we've got 3 where the judges would ordinarily be sitting. We've got a variety of different stations and chairs to think again about questions about what resources or what texts judges might draw on as they think about justice and judgment. So at the one station up here at the corner, and you can wander around afterwards, we have books, but I'll hold up a book display, or people could come around behind if they want. So here is 4 different books, resources that could be drawn on. One is a paper bag book where the student stapled together paper bags and then has produced this book that's engaging with the economy. Each of the paper bags has in it a little pull-out handout that gives more about the questions that are elaborated on the particular page of the book. So this is one, again, on economy and how it might look different, the story of the economy. We have books of poetry that we've all had handed in different contexts. This one is a small book of poems that are again matched to poems for agency, poems for partnerships, which come out in couplets, as you might imagine. This is the poem of sole proprietor that is unbounded by any formal choices. They can go on as long as they want. Co-ops, cooperatives, and a discussion at the end about such things as font choices and preambular additions. So you can kind of explore those books. Other books have come in for all of us that are in the nature of kind of photo essay books. So students who've engaged with their own family farms, for example, to think about what they learned through a series of photo commentaries. Right? So the form of the book can be quite divergent. Or again, this is our fabulous student who did the trans man, handed in a trans zine for crim law in first year. So there's a fabulous zine up here that you can flip through, just capturing multiple. We've had also handed in children's books, coloring books, found object books. So there's many forms in which the book can be rethought as a resource for other people. So books as resources. On the far end, maybe Sara, did you want to speak to the...
Yes, so I have, for family law again, various ways to address particular issues. One, we had a film script, or a play script by one of the actors in Lawyers on Stage theater production, where basically she took 3 points of time, one being 1970, one being 2015, and then also the future, and what it is in relation to how one is able to be in terms of gender diversity in that. And so she was working through, again, it's hopeful in terms of the 2050 as to our taken for granted as to your identity or your gender identity. We have another one that was a children's book. Laura did this last year, where it seems quite very simple, but what she was also trying to work through is she did a lot of reading around how children's literature, looking at Des Manderson's work, how children's literature basically teaches children the law from a very early age, and she was trying to work through what might laws be taught in relation to a particular issue. Cody finds Kit Kat. So it was about the finding and keeping and having to let go and all this sort of, again, learning the law as a child. And she was, she not only did it, performed this, but also theorized it in her performance of it. And another one is a short story called The Prenuptial Agreement. Again, we talked about prenuptial agreements in class. It wasn't necessarily giving any more information about it, but it was the genre taught me so much more about what the issues are in relation to prenuptial agreements that the student was trying to work through. And just one other one that's not here, but I learned so much from, was a poem. It was about a case that many of you know. I mean, there's lots of these different cases. A blood transfusion case of her child, a Jehovah's Witness child. So I'd read this case many times, This particular student wrote about it from the perspective of the characters. He put it into an epic poem. By the end of it, I was bawling my eyes out. Like I'd never actually... it just brought in so much more insight into this case than I could ever imagine. And I tend to, the more they make me cry, I might raise the mark. Because it just means that you feel it here, like the prenuptial agreement, I felt it here. And so I'm learning as much as they're learning as well.
So that's probably a good snapshot of the thing. There are more things we could talk about and spend more time. So just maybe some space for some questions you might have, or
The math.
what's going on
Come
there.
on, talk about it.
So there's a full-size figure. Again, was handed in sexual orientation in the law, and was the creation of a student who is an Indigenous person who is in a partner. Her partner is a trans man, and the sort of various ways in which she was living a life as a two-spirited person. And so it has many sides. It draws on different notions of what it means to be, and I hang it in my office. I take it around with me to things every once in a while. I just put her in the building in places to sit. Very powerful and interactive, and when I took it to a presentation where I was trying to talk to our colleagues about doing projects and the challenges of markings and the challenges of doing this work, the people from the art school here were just enamored with this piece. They thought it was amazing. So she's sitting looking out the window so that as everyone passes by on their way to 159, they get to engage with her. Anyway, we'll create some space for you to ask questions. I unfortunately have to dash off, but if I win the T-shirt, I still want it.
Yeah, there is a T-shirt draw that I promised we would do at sort of...
So thank you all, and please, we'd love to hear your questions. We love your continued engagement, and some huge thank yous for our ability to do what we've done in this room this week, to Sara, whose energy has been extraordinary in keeping us going for Idea Fest, to Lorinda Fraser, whose curatorial eye enabled us to set up the room in this way, and to all of the students whose bravery and has taken up these challenges, both in their paper writing and in these projects, in order to make us better teachers along the way. So.
May I just add one thing in terms of bravery, as Kristen's dance is on the big screen. Talk about brave. So Kristen performed her family law assignment in the family law class. So her fellow students were probably didn't quite know how to take it. She also got Bikers Against Child Abuse to come in and stand against the blackboard for about 20 minutes. And she also produced an explanation, so which is at the side there, right beside the big screen, if you want to read about it. I don't know, Kristen, do you want to maybe say something about your experience?
Well,
not to put you on the spot, if you don't
just the opportunity to do something that other than just write helped me to just understand how family law impacts children, but also how family law's impact on my own body might make me as a family law lawyer more likely to see some possibilities rather than others. So it's sort of like in actually embodying the concepts. And I was trying to think, well, I read a lot of child protection cases and then noticed the gestures that would come up in my body as I read them. And in my first year of law, when I started to get sad when I would read cases, I started to just kind of compartmentalize and cut off from the cases. But when it came to child protection stuff, I would often just get very, very sad. And I thought that my sadness was like this waste of time because I would sometimes have to take 5 minutes to cry and then go back to the case. So instead of pathologizing my emotional reactions to the cases, I decided that I would amplify the reaction and notice my body's gestures as a kind of register of some of the unspoken material in the cases. And that helped me actually get stronger in, it's not like I ever want to be able to handle some of the things that I don't really think that the human is really built to handle, the outside edges of horror that I think if we're ever able to handle them, they can become problematic. But it gave me this certain kind of strength. So instead of either being kind of numb or just crying on the floor, I was able to go through and have this fluid kind of legal reasoning that I think will let me see a lot more angles of family law cases. And I don't think it would have been possible if it weren't for not just the dance, but also going down to the Starbucks late at night to meet Tug, the representative from the Bikers Against Child Abuse, and these actual interactions with people that for me really is what law is made out of, not just kind of this narrow thing called legal reasoning. So I loved the opportunity, and I felt so grateful for Professor Ramshaw, and I feel so grateful for just the kind of leadership that I see in the faculty at the law school that makes this kind of thing possible, and also that theorizes it so you're not just doing an interpretive dance, which is sort of shunned generally speaking. But for me, dance is a highly articulate and sophisticated form of reasoning. So for that to have a theoretical basis and an understanding that it is part of law makes me really glad that I decided to come to UVic for law school, and I'm grateful. So that's what I have to say.
So thank you all of you for coming and sharing this time with us, because this is work that we have been nourished by, and where we too are so grateful for actually a context of a law school that makes it possible for us to do this without it being seen as radical or on the edge, just as part of the work of thinking of pedagogy. And hopefully some interesting things for the ones we haven't talked about, you can ask us more questions about. And I'm going to draw. Have you all put your name in for the t-shirt? Okay, you have 5 minutes if you haven't to get your name in for the t-shirt draw. Oh, if you haven't got your name in, tough luck for you.